Hi everyone, it's Ben here. We're back again today doing another film review. Today, the film that we're going to be talking about is Martin Scorsese's Casino, which came out in 1995, starring principally the three actors on screen Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, and Sharon Stone. Besides that, some of the main supporting players include Kevin Pollak, Don Rickles, Frank Vincent. Um, this is a film of Scorsese's that doesn't get much attention, doesn't get talked about a ton in circles of people who want to discuss Scorsese. Typically it's Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, Goodfellas. Maybe if you're looking at his more recent work, it's like The Wolf of Wall Street or even The Irishman. But I think this is a film of his that kind of gets lost in the shuffle and people don't talk about it much. It didn't get much attention at the Academy Awards. It actually, I believe, only got one nomination, which was for Sharon Stone for Best Actress in a Leading Role. But I really enjoy the film. I find it to be one of his more underrated movies. It is very good, and today I want to kind of go through and break down what I think of various aspects of the film and sort of do a film review. So if you're unfamiliar with the film, it is uh, based on true story, based on a book by Nicholas Pileggi, who also wrote the screenplay, much like he did for Goodfellas. He wrote the nonfiction book that Goodfellas was based on, and then he also wrote the screenplay. So him and Scorsese were again teaming up in '95 for this take on the Las Vegas casino scene in the really it's mainly the 70s that they're looking at, and then into the 80s as well. And focusing primarily on Robert De Niro, who plays Sam Rothstein, who is the mafia's Jewish. Originally, he's like a handicapper, and then he becomes the runner of one of their big casinos out in Vegas. Um, Joe Pesci plays his longtime friend, who is a mob boss, and he's also sent out to Vegas to run the mob out there. And then Sharon Stone plays De Niro's wife. And the film is an epic. It's very long. It's 3 hours. But to me, I think a real strength of this movie is even though it's 3 hours long, it doesn't ever feel like it's super slow or anything. I feel like it's always saying something at any given point in the movie, and I never felt at any point bored or anything like that. And I think that's definitely a strength of any 3 hour movie. If you don't feel bored or if you don't feel like it's bloated, that's a really good sign. The subjects I want to talk about today include acting, writing, directing, cinematography, and editing. Those are kind of like the five things that I look at when I think about a movie. Um, so I guess starting off with acting, I think it's very solid. As I said earlier, it didn't really get any awards nominations as far as um, the SAG Awards, the Golden Globes, the Critics' Choice, or even besides Sharon Stone's nomination, it didn't really get anything else at the Oscars. So I guess Sharon Stone we can talk about first since she was Oscar nominated. I think she does good here. I don't know if I'm sold on her being Oscar nomination worthy necessarily though. I think as I say she does good, but I don't see anything that makes her go above and beyond. Like for instance, if I'm comparing this to Lorraine Bracco's performance in Goodfellas 5 years ago, um, I think Lorraine Bracco knocked it out of the park, and I think Sharon Stone does good, but not phenomenal like Lorraine Bracco did. Um, I think she's a necessary force in the story, and she plays her part, but doesn't exceed my expectations necessarily. I guess she really portray what she does best in this movie is she's very believable, both as kind of like the young, hot starlet in Vegas, and then also as kind of the later on the drug addict, strung out mother that she plays later on. She's very believable portraying both of those sides of the character, and so I think from that perspective she does really well. Um, Joe Pesci is interesting here. He has a weird accent in this movie, and it's never more apparent than during the voiceovers where he is like directly talking to the audience essentially. And they do this a lot in the movie. They bounce back and forth doing voiceovers between him and De Niro. And then actually they bounce it over to Frank Vincent to do a short monologue at one point as well. I think He shouldn't have had any sort of an accent really. I feel like his character is technically from Chicago, I believe, and he was like attempting his best Midwestern accent, and he should have just not tried it at all because to me it felt like you could tell he was trying to do an accent, which kind of takes you out of the character a bit. But that was honestly only during the voiceover. His actual acting is fairly decent, very good actually, if I'm being frank. It's not as outlandish and pompous and flashy as he was in Goodfellas, where of course he won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. But it is still impressive, I think, and I think the only reason that his role in this wouldn't get much attention is because he's basically playing a watered down version of his character in Goodfellas. And that's no fault of his own. That's really the writing, if anything. And considering this is based on a true story, and he's really just doing what the guy in real life did, and then also considering that he was kind of getting typecast as he was being put into a very similar role, it's no wonder that naturally people weren't as impressed because he was doing a lot of the same things. They just weren't as flashy, I guess you'd say. But overall does a good job and portrays what he's trying to portray very well in the film. And the dynamic between him and De Niro is great. Obviously, they have a lot of chemistry from previous films, and there's this real tension between the two of them. Even though they're good friends throughout the film, there's like constant tension between them, and it's not even what they're saying; it's just how their body language is reacting off of one another, and that is phenomenal. And really leading that into my comments on Robert De Niro's performance, he has these different types of performances he can give, and my favorite side of De Niro is when he gives these quiet, reserved roles where he's doing a lot of acting with his mannerisms, and it's more about what he's not saying than rather what he is saying and how he's conveying his body language and actions rather than his dialogue per se, because he himself is not like a he's not necessarily charismatic or ever going to be like zany or outlandish or um, like a Pacino or a Nicholson, but he does this really quiet, reserved stoicism better than basically anybody, and he does a lot of that in this movie. And it's juxtaposed with these really funny outfits that he has on because he's in Vegas and he's really digging it. So he has a lot of like pink, green, orange, yellow suits that just go so well and contrast his stoic personality so well in this movie. So really love De Niro in this. He just nailed exactly what I think they wanted him to go for. I was a little surprised he didn't get any awards recognition. I think it was probably because with this movie being like a 3 hour epic and him not having like a very showy role, it was more stoic. Then of course you don't always get acknowledged for those kind of performances. But honestly, there were some shades of similarity with his role in this to his role in The Irishman, like very reserved, but I really enjoyed it. As far as the supporting characters, I think the main standout was Frank Vincent, as I say. Um, he did have a voiceover for narration at one point, which I thought was misguided, but overall, this is he's been in a lot of mob type of TV shows and movies, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, Sopranos, and then this Casino, and this is probably the biggest role he's had in any of those, in a movie at least. And he did well. He's always very solid in his performances, so I liked him a lot. James Woods was very good as well as comedic relief. Um, Liked him a lot. Okay, as far as writing goes, moving on to the next section, I thought it was well written. I thought it wasn't as it wasn't as fast paced and chaotic and exciting necessarily as Goodfellas, but I also think that that's the pitfall that this movie continues to run into is that people are constantly always trying to compare it to Goodfellas and Raging Bull, which it's really a very, very different story. It's a story that builds momentum over time, and you never really come to a crescendo of a climax necessarily because the quote unquote bad guy is like there isn't really one. It's just the faults of the people involved, the main characters between, you know, the three people on screen here, they're the ones who are the culprits for their own downfalls, and so I guess the closest thing you have to a antagonist per se is the mob bosses back in the Midwest, but we don't ever really get to know them that well, so it's hard to ever feel that conflict with them necessarily. But I like the gradual pace of the writing, and as I said earlier, the movie is still never boring, even though the writing is more gradual than, say, Goodfellas is. It's never boring. It's like every scene serves a purpose, and that is a really good sign for any movie. If every scene can serve a purpose, that means that you're doing your job as a director to me. The dialogue is pretty standard, I would say. There's nothing remarkable about it. Yeah, I think the writing is just like for par, pretty decent. They adapted it pretty well from the book. Nicholas Pileggi is pretty pretty solid at writing both book and screenplay. That's not easy to pull off. Usually writers are more suited for one or the other, but he seems pretty skilled at going back and forth between the two. So my hat's off to him. Moving on to the direction. Um, I think Scorsese doesn't do his best direction of any movie ever in this film. He does good, but there are a few choices that I would have probably changed up if I were him. I would have done less narration and voiceover, and I would have stuck with about one narrator, I think. He kind of took this from Goodfellas, I think. And again, I'm not trying to compare this to Goodfellas, but Goodfellas had Ray Liotta narrating the whole thing, and he tried to do the same with De Niro here. And I think it would have worked fine if you just had De Niro, but they bounce back and forth a lot between De Niro and Pesci, De Niro, Pesci, and then they have Frank Vincent jump in and narrate at one point, and to me that wasn't a good idea. You could have just shown the scene with Frank Vincent without having him narrate over it. Um, so yeah, from that perspective, I would have changed that choice. Honestly, besides that, there's nothing glaringly bad that sticks out as far as the direction, which is a good thing. Um, I think if anything, what stands out is good soundtrack, as any Scorsese movie has. But maybe just the lack of things that stick out is the most notable because, with certain movies like Raging Bull, you can point to the cinematography as like the big notable thing about that movie. Um, Goodfellas, it's like one of the most classic soundtracks of all time, along with some unique tracking shots at various points. But direction wise, Casino is probably one of the least flashy or notable films for Scorsese. He does good, but there's nothing necessarily notable about it. It just feels kind of standard from a direction standpoint, but still good. That's a thing that I want to note. Um, Moving on to cinematography, again, nothing super notable. I do. It's not a movie that was shot to be a spectacle as far as the camera work or what they're showing on screen necessarily. The shots of Vegas with all the colorful aspects of Vegas, there's some of that, but not a ton of it actually. Um, the colors are fleshed out as they should be when they should be. Sam Rothstein wears, as I said earlier, wears a lot of colorful suits. That's entertaining. Um, but yeah, I don't look at anything particular about the movie that is as far as the photography of it. I don't notice anything that really sticks out and makes me think, wow, that was really done particularly well. Um, so yeah, from that perspective, again, like pretty solid, but not really a movie that you're looking at from a cinematography free standpoint and looking for it to stand out a ton. Editing, I like the editing. As I said earlier with the soundtrack, they mix in music well to this movie, and you don't really notice it while you're watching it, but it is there and it's well placed. That's always a good sign if you don't notice that kind of a thing. Um, Voiceover, again, a weakness of the editing. I think they could have cut a lot of it out. It's it's useful in some parts, but in other parts it kind of feels like unnecessary and that you could be connecting the dots without it. They do some cool, I guess I don't know if you call them montages. There's like sequences where they're showing things on screen while somebody's narrating, basically giving you exposition. The exposition part's not phenomenal, but what I do like is like what they're showing. So like at the end, De Niro's explaining kind of like what happened to Vegas and how it changed over the years, and they show like the old casinos being demolished and the new ones being built up, and like the change in demographic of who was going to casinos and things like that. I like that sequence quite a bit. Um, yeah, there were actually a few montages in this movie now that I think about it, and all of them were done fine. I guess in a 3-hour movie, you're bound to maybe have more than one, so it makes sense that they had, I think about three. Yeah, but again, the editing relatively standard for me. If I'm looking at this movie from a whole and kind of grading, giving different grades to different parts of the movie, I'd say acting. Um, I'll give an A minus two. I'd say the standouts are De Niro and James Woods, and I think really solid, good performances from Pesci and Stone and the rest of the supporting players. Um, as far as writing, I'd again give, I think I'll give it like um, an A minus. The the adaptation from the book is well done. Pileggi doesn't do anything special with dialogue necessarily, but he does what I would expect and what I would have wanted. So that's pretty good in my opinion. Direction, I'm going to give it a little bit lower. I'm going to give it a B. I think, as I said earlier, Scorsese does a good job, and the movie as a whole, as far as the direction, just feels very like standard and like nothing groundbreaking or difficult about making it necessarily. It feels like it is an epic, but the movie itself is not epic, if that makes sense. Like it's this big long story with a lot of interesting aspects to it, but there's nothing about how it's told or the direction of it that is um like overwhelmingly amazing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So direction, good but not outstanding. Editing and cinematography, I think I'll give both of these about um, a B plus. And I think with editing, it's a weird concept in that sometimes you want to almost not notice the editing because that means that it's really fluid and seamless. And this movie did quite a bit of that. My only gripe with the editing is the how the narration was included. Um, And then cinematography, not a movie that's shot to be like beautiful and like jaw-dropping landscapes or um, like an explosion of color at any given point, but it's just shot the exact way it should be. Um, but nothing like I wouldn't use the word impressive when thinking about the cinematography, so a B plus for that as well. So overall, I'm going to give this film an A minus, and I really enjoyed it. If you haven't seen it, you should go out and watch it. It's one of Scorsese's more underrated films, and a lot of people think that it's kind of just a watered down version of Goodfellas. Well, let me tell you, the story is very different. The journey that you go on is different and unique and fun, and it's worth the watch. So, I hope you guys enjoyed the review, and we'll see you next time. Bye.